Good afternoon, everyone. It's just now 3 o'clock, so we'll just give people a few more minutes to join the Zoom, and we'll get started with today's community webinar on cancer cachexia. All right, good afternoon again. Thank you so much for joining. I am Felicia Woods, the Executive Director of the Cancer Policy Institute at the Cancer Support Community. On behalf of the CSC and all patients, survivors, and caregivers impacted by cachexia, I would like to extend my heartfelt appreciation to each of you for being on today's webinar and coming here to learn more about cancer cachexia and our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, which will be coming up soon. So just want to do a brief welcome and talk to you a little bit about what an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting is. So this is an exciting initiative to inform the FDA about the patient perspective of living with cancer cachexia. And we want you to make your voice heard. So this will be your one-time opportunity to share your story of living with cancer cachexia with the FDA. And it doesn't matter where you live, where you are in your journey, or what matters in your story. The primary goal of this meeting is to hear directly from patients and caregivers about perspectives on living with cancer cachexia and the experiences with treatments to improve the development of new drugs in the research pipeline. And this is also a way for the patient perspective to just be heard by stakeholders from the FDA and other industry partners. So the patient perspective is really critical in helping the US Food and Drug Administration understand the context in which regulatory decisions are made for new drugs. And we would love to just take a moment to thank our generous sponsors, Pfizer, Roche, and Aveo Oncology for their support with this much needed PFDD on cancer cachexia. So we're just very grateful for their support in helping us to facilitate this much needed discussion. I like to go through a few webinar housekeeping items just to inform you all. So today's webinar is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour, and all participants will be muted to allow the speakers to present without interruptions. Please know that this webinar will be recorded and is being recorded so that it can be later viewed on Facebook or YouTube. And if you want to ask a question during the webinar, please feel free to do so by using your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those questions at the end of the webinar. So before we move forward in the program, I'd just like to briefly talk to you about cancer cachexia. So this is a medical term that is used to describe what happens when people with cancer have unintentional weight loss that impacts their health and quality of life. Many people who have cancer and are experiencing cancer cachexia have never heard of this term or received an actual diagnosis for cancer cachexia. So patients and their caregivers tend to struggle with many issues relating to cancer cachexia, and there are no currently approved therapies for this condition. So today's webinar and the upcoming November 2nd patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA are really aimed at increasing awareness and understanding the impacts of cancer cachexia on people's lives, and to help create a positive environment for development of effective therapies in the near future. So now I'd just like to welcome our speakers for today. We have James Valentine and Larry Bauer from the law firm of Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, who have been very instrumental in helping CSC over the past few months and planning this meeting. James has worked the last 13 years as a champion for the patient voice. He previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison, helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product reviews. And there, he helped to develop and launch the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. Larry also worked at the National Institutes of Health for 17 years, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist working on policy, education, and science related to rare disease drug development. Now in private practice, both James and Larry have worked with many patient organizations like CSC to ensure that their community's voices were raised and heard by decision makers. So together, they've been involved in planning and moderating 3/4 of over 50 externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. So now I'll turn it over to James and Larry for them to continue with the presentation, and we'll be back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia, for the introduction. This is James Valentine here, and I'm with my colleague Larry Bauer, who you'll be hearing from shortly. So this is an exciting opportunity, as Felicia was describing, to have your voices heard, individuals living with cancer, cachexia, or caregivers, whether spouse, a child of a patient, or a parent of a patient, someone living, with these symptoms, the unexpected weight loss, and the whole really cascade then of different symptoms and health effects that are a result of having cachexia, whether or not, as Felicia said, you have that diagnosis. So today is our opportunity to give you a little bit of an orientation to what this is all about. We're going to focus on describing your role as patient stakeholders in drug development, talk about this patient-focused drug development, or sometimes you'll hear us refer to it as PFDD, what this meeting and initiative is all about, and how you can participate in the November 2nd meeting. Before we get into some of the details and some of the education, we want to give you a little bit of an understanding of why we're here. The purpose of this meeting is to educate the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, which is the United States federal agency that oversees the review and approval of new drugs and other medical products. It's important for them to be educated about what it is like to live with cancer cachexia, how cancer cachexia has impacted you or your loved one's life, how you're currently managing cancer cachexia, and what meaningful treatments might look like. You might be wondering, why should you, as a person out in the world living with cancer cachexia or a caregiver, participate? This is a really important opportunity to have your voices heard. As I was mentioning, FDA approves all treatments for cancer cachexia, and so it needs to know what is important to you in helping think through and apply in its decision making the judgment of what it is that this patient community needs. This knowledge is going to impact their decision making and ultimately lead to better treatments and hopefully even potentially faster approvals for cancer cachexia treatments. You might be wondering why now. Cancer and cancer cachexia have existed for a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, the patient's voice has historically been absent from the drug development process. It was usually only when a drug was approved or when a clinical trial was failing and the drug company and FDA needed input from patients to understand why that patients were brought into the process. This was very late, after clinical trials had been conducted and review, the FDA review had occurred or was in the middle of occurring. So there's been a realization that it's important to hear your voices from the beginning of the process and throughout, not just at the end. That will actually help make drug development better across the board. And we'll talk a little bit about how that works. And now, because of many good experiences that FDA has had in hearing from patients and learning from them, they've made stakeholder engagement a priority. And actually, when both Larry and I were at the FDA, initiated this PFDD program as a more systematic way to learn about patients' lives, both from the patient perspective, the person living with the condition, as well as from their direct caregivers. Those are both very important perspectives. So for today's program, as we dive into some more detailed information, we're going to cover a little bit about FDA and drug development. We know some of you may be familiar with this, but we think it's important to kind of understand how drugs get to this point in the process where your voices are important. That'll take us to the second item on our agenda, which is to understand patient-focused drug development, and as part of that, why patient input is so important to FDA and drug development. So you'll get to see where your voices plug into that process. We'll make sure to give you some specific details about participating in the meeting, logistics, the format of the meeting, tips for participating, as well as some other important information that will come at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm going to cover this first part of our kind of the educational piece of this, which is really some background on FDA and drug development. We want you to know how drugs get to patients and ultimately get to FDA for review. This all starts very early. This is very early in development drugs. We don't actually have drugs as we think of them. We have researchers who are looking to see where there might be, from understanding the basic science, the disease biology, what might we be able to intervene and stop or maybe even reverse effects of a disease. We can screen different molecular compounds or even biological products to see what might have a beneficial effect in that biological process. Maybe some existing treatments might have unanticipated effects and be useful. A lot of the times this happens. This is called repurposing. Other new technologies might provide new ways to target medical products at specific sites within the body. So as science advances and medicine advances, it keeps unlocking new ways to create new drugs that could be useful. So once those researchers identify a promising compound, whether that's a drug or a biological product like a cell or gene therapy, the development of drugs then follows a pretty well-established path to help make sure that that compound is safe and effective when it ultimately reaches the public. So during that first stage of testing of that compound is called preclinical development. Preclinical meaning before humans, so before it's tested in humans. This part of development is where often the drug is being evaluated in animals, both for safety and to see if there's animal models of that condition, meaning the animal has the clinical condition. You can see if the drug has the beneficial effect. And we're looking to see if it's reasonably safe for use in initial use in humans. And again, to make sure it is actually at least addressing the disease target that is expected to translate into a treatment benefit in people. Once we've done this preclinical work, these studies in animals, or maybe you can think of this as some other types of tests like in the Petri dish, we are able to take those results and ultimately put them into what is called an investigational new drug application, or IND. This is an application that a researcher or drug company submits to FDA to allow them to start testing the drug in people. So in that IND submission, the company or the researcher will provide FDA all of those pharmacology and toxicology studies. Those are those preclinical studies I was just talking about. Pharmacology meaning, whether the drug kind of gets to the targets that it needs to, and toxicology being safety. They also provide other information. They have to explain how they manufacture the product. We want to make sure that drugs are potent, that they actually are made consistently, that they don't have impurities that might harm people. So that FDA reviews that as well as their proposal for what their first clinical trial will be. And so that protocol or study plan as well as who's going to conduct that study, the investigator, is provided in that IND submission. Once FDA gives the green light and says that the drug can then be studied in humans, the first phase of clinical studies is called phase 1. These are the smallest, shortest studies that are conducted. They can be in healthy volunteers or sometimes in actually individuals living with the condition. And this is really focused on safety. We're often escalating doses, a little bit higher dose each time to see what is a safe dose that can be tolerated. While we're doing this, we're able to identify what are the most common side effects of the drug, as well as start to, through like blood draws and other types of, laboratory measures, see how the drug actually is metabolized and excreted. How long does it stay in the body? What parts of the body is it getting to? All important questions to being able to then design your next stages of drug development, where you're going to be narrowing down the dose you're going to study, and start to actually analyze whether the drug has the treatment benefit that's intended. So that's what starts to happen in phase 2, the next stage of drug development. Here, this is the first time we're really starting to emphasize the drug's effectiveness or its benefit for patients. We want to know that if the drug actually has the effect that it's intended in patients. So whereas a phase 1 might be in a healthy volunteer group, we are always conducting phase 2 studies in actual people with the condition. When people volunteer to participate in studies, this might a phase 2, is a little bit shorter than some, but still longer than a phase 1 study, long enough to start to see signals or early signs that the drug benefit is occurring. We also start to, in phase 2, because we're evaluating the drug benefit, compare that drug against placebo or some other control group, so we can see what's due to the drug effect versus other factors besides the drug itself. And then finally, and this is a theme throughout drug development, we're monitoring for short-term side effects and other safety issues. We're always collecting safety information. The more people that use a drug, the more, over longer periods of time, we're able to say, start detecting maybe more, less common side effects. And we're able to see what's really, what the different rates are, and how well the drug is tolerated, particularly at different doses. So once we have that information, we have that proof of concept that the drug actually is benefiting patients, it hasn't, we have some more safety information. We then go into phase 3. Phase 3 studies are sometimes called pivotal studies or registration studies. These are the large, long studies that actually, most directly support conclusions that the drug is both safe and effective. So these are often the studies that are most discussed, in the news or published in medical journals. Here, where these are the studies that are often the randomized placebo-controlled trials, and are again of the largest size. Here we're evaluating effectiveness because these are longer studies. We're able to evaluate the duration of effect, not only just those early signs, but do the benefits continue to grow as patients use the drug longer? Or is there a plateau? Or does the effect wear off? Because these are larger studies, we can actually see the effect in different subpopulations, whether that's sex or race or age, or even maybe different underlying cancer or other cancer treatments that might have been used or currently are being used. So we can see, does the drug work better or worse, or is it safer or less safe, depending on which population it's being used in. And we can still continue to assess different doses of the drug, even in phase 3. And like I said, we continue to evaluate safety. Phase 3 tends to be, a more generalizable group, meaning it's more reflective of patients that will use it in the real world than at least phase 1 and 2 studies. Here we can begin to also evaluate potential drug-drug interactions, with commonly used drugs, within a given patient population as well. Usually, FDA's rule of thumb is that you need 2 positive phase 3 studies, although in certain circumstances, FDA can approve drugs off of a single phase 3 study. But these really are the studies that FDA is going to be looking to understand if a drug, again, actually has the treatment benefit. Ultimately, it's then up to the company or the researcher to take all of that information from clinical trials and bring it before FDA before actually submitting what's called either an NDA or a new drug application for a traditional drug, or for like a cell therapy or a vaccine. Those are biologics. So that would be a biologics license application, or BLA. Before a company submits either an NDA or a BLA, they typically will meet with FDA in what's called a pre-NDA meeting. And in that meeting, they bring forward these phase 3 clinical trial results. They discuss their analyses of those results. And they hope to, in talking to FDA, uncover any major unresolved issues. Hopefully by this point, safety and efficacy have been established. But there may be, sometimes data is hard to interpret. And so there might be additional work that needs to be done or additional analyses, and that can be discussed and identified during this meeting. Ultimately, if it's a go to submit that NDA or BLA to the FDA, it includes everything that we've talked about, all of the animal and other preclinical studies, all of the human data from phases 1, 2, and 3. That all goes into the NDA or BLA for FDA to review. It's during that review that FDA finally gets to really roll up its sleeves. But before it does roll up its sleeves, it first has to decide if that application is complete, meaning it has all the information that it would expect in order to allow it to conduct a full review. If it concludes that the application is complete, it will file it. And upon filing, the review team will then go into evaluating whether the drug works, its effectiveness, what is the drug's safety profile, and do the benefits of the drug that outweigh those safety risks. And similar to the IND early in development, in this NDA or BLA, FDA is also looking at manufacturing methods and controls. Again, we want to make sure that these are high quality products that have consistent amount of the active drug, avoid those impurities that could harm patients. So that is also part of the FDA review, and FDA will actually even conduct an inspection of the manufacturing facility. During this review, FDA can, it's not required to, but it can consult with expert advisors in what's called an advisory committee and convene an advisory committee meeting. Those experts include a patient representative, and they help answer questions that FDA may have. So often these types of meetings are convened when it's not a clear yes or no approval or non-approval type decision, but FDA is kind of working through, and they want to help get some additional expert input to help them make their decision. Ultimately, though, the final decision is still FDA's, regardless of what the advisory committee votes. So even once a drug's approved, FDA and companies still have a role to help monitor the safety of drugs. This is called post-market safety surveillance. You can imagine, even though you test the drug in more and more patients in longer, larger studies through phase 1, 2, and 3, it's still a relatively small amount of patients compared to the number of patients that will use the drug out in the real world once it's approved. And what that means is you're likely to uncover some really, rare side effects, things that maybe happen, 1 in a million type thing. You can't pick that up though until it's been in a million people. So, there's monitoring that happens, and when safety issues are reported, that gets reported to FDA. And FDA continues to monitor and make sure that benefit risk balance, and make sure that the drug's benefit continues to outweigh even these new risks that are reported. So we think that that's useful information to understand, how does that drug get from this, when it's discovered all the way to, to the patient when it's approved, because this is the environment in which we're trying to make sure your voices are heard, to make sure that throughout that entire process, it's informed by what's important to patients, what your needs are, what your priorities are. And so, it's both drug developers and FDA that benefit from your input. But I want to talk a little bit, now that you know how drugs get developed, about FDA's role, because FDA is our audience for this patient-focused drug development meeting. So it's valuable to know, what is their job and what isn't their job. That way you can, bring to light the most relevant of your experiences. So the first area is about that drug development and clinical trials. So in case it wasn't clear, FDA does not actually develop the drugs. So those drugs get developed by researchers, pharmaceutical companies, even nonprofit groups will conduct this type of research. They also are not testing the drugs in clinical trials. So they're not running those studies that we talked about. They're not on site for those clinical trials. It's the researchers and drug companies that that conduct that, and they have to get FDA approval before getting those studies. So they're talking, and FDA is, aware of what's going on, but it's not FDA that conducts it, and FDA can't make a company conduct any particular study. I also want to talk about the practice of medicine. So what are doctors and other healthcare providers? What's their relationship to FDA, as well as drug costs? So it's important to know that FDA does not have authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So FDA doesn't have any say over what doctors get to do with their patients. FDA instead regulates the development and the marketing of medical products. So they're really regulating the drug companies. That's who FDA regulates. That means that doctors, even once a drug is approved, doctors are free to prescribe that approved drug for other conditions or other populations that aren't approved. This is probably, you're familiar with the term off-label drug use. That's why this is, because FDA does not have authority to regulate off-label use. FDA also does not regulate the price of medicine. So when FDA is reviewing those new drugs and they're determining if the benefits outweigh the risks, they're not doing a cost benefit analysis. They don't have information about drug pricing. Even if they did, they couldn't take that into account in making their decision. It's not part of their mandate. So drug pricing and access issues are things that FDA has no say over, they can't help with. So even though I've kind of talked a lot about what FDA doesn't do, I do want to talk a little bit about their role in helping facilitate drug development. So even though they're not the ones running studies, they do have a big role in helping promote the public health. And FDA reviewers, they're seeing every drug, that's in development, right? So a drug developer, a researcher, they only, the people that they're working with only know what they've seen. And so it's never as much as what FDA's seen. And so FDA, because of that, allow their reviewers and can allow their reviewers to meet with drug companies throughout that drug development process. And drug companies can, propose clinical trial designs, propose different endpoints to measure benefit, and get input from FDA. So that way they can get that technical expertise from the agency. So that way they can better design studies that are informed. FDA might know what are the pitfalls, what are some traps that if we design a study a certain way, it's not going to be interpretable. So again, this happens through a series of meetings and other written exchanges where drug companies can benefit from FDA's review experience. So I know I've covered a lot here about how drugs are developed and what FDA's role in all of this is. It's valuable to keep that in the back of your minds, as I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Larry here in a moment, as he talks about the role of your voices in all of this. So it's always, in doing good advocacy, good to keep in mind your audience, and our audience is FDA. That being said, if you're interested in learning more than what we covered today, FDA has a really good resource webpage for patient stakeholders like yourselves. And that's listed here on this slide at fda.gov/for-patients. So we encourage you, if you're interested, to check that out. But at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Larry Bauer to talk a little bit more about the role of the patient voice and more specifically, this patient-focused drug development initiative.
Thank you so much, James. So, yeah, thanks for that. That was a great overview, James, of drug review and what's the FDA's role. Now, at this point in the meeting, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about our meeting that's going to happen on November 2nd, this patient-focused drug development meeting. Next slide. So the purpose of the meeting is that FDA wanted a more systematic way to gather the patient perspective about different conditions and the treatment options available. They wanted this information from patients to help inform their understanding of the context for benefit and risk assessment when they're assessing new drugs. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in just a second. And also patient input helps the FDA during drug development and their review of an application of a new drug. Next, please. So every time the FDA gets all the information from a drug company about a new drug, they have to make a decision. Are we going to approve this drug and let it go out into pharmacies so that doctors can prescribe it? Or are we going to say, no, we're not going to approve it. There was not good enough information. Part of the way that they do this is they make a determination whether the benefits of the drug, so the ways that it helps, do those benefits outweigh the risks? And the risks are the side effects, the challenges of using the drug. And they go through a very formal process of making this assessment. They analyze the condition and the current treatment options. So in other words, they want to understand what the disease or condition is that the drug is being developed for, and they want to understand what's currently available. This provides the regulators with the clinical context, we call it, for weighing the benefits and risks. And then the actual benefits and risks come from the data from the clinical studies that the drug companies conducted. So they have to present all the data from the clinical trials to show how did this help people and what kind of side effects did they see in the trials. Next, please. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of our meeting. So this is the Cancer Cachexia Voice of the Patient meeting. This meeting is going to be designed using the framework that the FDA developed. We're going to discuss questions about benefit risk, and these questions represent important considerations in the FDA's decision-making. So we reviewed this and other disease area questions and tailored our agenda for this meeting and the panel questions to try to communicate the most important information related to cancer cachexia. And the FDA helped us a little bit in planning this, and they have really emphasized that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. Once the meeting is finished, we will formulate a report about the meeting called the Voice of the Patient Report. This is going to be a summary of the caregiver and audience testimony, the polling data that we collect, and any submitted written comments that we collect. This document, this Voice of the Patient Report, is a key communication to FDA review staff and the regulated industry about what patients and caregivers most want to see in a new treatment. And FDA says that they really want this information because it informs them about better ways to develop meaningful treatments for cancer cachexia. Next slide. So how can you participate in the meeting, which is what we hope all of you will do? So who is it for? It's for cancer cachexia patients and their caregivers. We hope to have as many FDA staff listening as possible. And we also hope that there's pharma and biotech companies in the audience, but it's also open to anyone interested in learning. So feel free to invite friends, families, your doctors, anyone can watch the meeting. It'll take place on November 2nd from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And it's a completely virtual meeting. So you will be tuning in on your computer to watch the meeting. And it's a live stream, so people can watch it from anywhere and participate in the meeting from anywhere. Next slide. So just to go over the agenda on the day of the meeting, we'll start with the welcome and introductory comments from the meeting co-moderator, as well as from a representative from the FDA. Then we've invited a doctor who's a specialist on cancer cachexia and clinical trials about cancer cachexia to kind of give us a basic background on cachexia. So everybody starts the meeting with the same kind of understanding. Then from there, the rest of the day will be broken up into two topics. The one in the morning will be how cancer cachexia symptoms affect your life. And then in the afternoon, after lunch, we'll take a lunch break. We'll shift gears to how you manage symptoms and current and future approaches to treatment. So things like, what would you like to see in the future? The topics for each of these two topics, they'll include pre-recorded patient and caregiver testimonies, as well as we'll use polling questions on the day of. You'll just use your cell phone. We'll give you the information on the day of the meeting, how to log in and answer questions. And there'll also be a moderated discussion with the entire audience that will be led by James, who you just heard, who will be the moderator for the meeting. And then we'll close the meeting with a summary and some final comments. Next. So what kind of questions will we discuss? Okay, so in the morning, our topic's going to be living with cancer cachexia. What are the symptoms and daily impacts? So some of the questions that we will be asking you all will be, of all the symptoms of cancer cachexia, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your life? We'd like to find out more about how cancer cachexia affects you on your best and on your worst days, and then ask you to describe your best and your worst days. We'd also like to know, are there specific activities that are important to you that you cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of cancer cachexia? Then we'll move on to another question about how have your symptoms changed over time? So have symptoms gotten worse? Are they better? And how has your ability to cope with the symptoms changed over time? We also would like to know, as you get older and as time progresses, what do you fear most? What worries you the most about your condition? Or maybe what frustrates you the most about your condition? Next. Like I said, then we will shift gears in the afternoon, and the afternoon we'll be talking about challenges to treating cancer cachexia. So some of the things we'll talk about then are, what are you currently doing to manage your cancer cachexia symptoms? What kind of medicines are you using, or treatments that maybe aren't pharmaceutical treatments? Maybe you're using things like acupuncture or meditation. And we'd like to know, how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of your cancer cachexia? We also want to know, of the treatments you're using, what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments, and how do they affect your daily life? So what are the side effects or the downsides of treatments? And finally, short of a complete cure, what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for cancer cachexia? So if there was something new being developed, how would you like that new treatment to look, and what would you like it to treat? Next. So the discussion format that I mentioned, after we see the pre-recorded panelists, there'll be a group of patients for each panel. This group is going to set the foundation for the broader audience discussion. And we selected these panelists. These are the ones that pre-recorded. They were selected to reflect a range of experiences with the condition. Once we've heard their pre-recorded statements, then the patients in the audience and online will have a chance to answer polling question. The purpose of the polling questions is a starting off point for the discussion that will follow. And like I said earlier, as a participant, you'll use your cell phone, or you can also use a tablet or laptop to respond to the questions. Then after the polling, the polling will happen throughout this discussion, but we'll have this moderated discussion with patients and caregivers in the audience. And the purpose of this is to build on the experiences shared by the panel. And James, our moderator, will be asking questions and invite you to submit responses to those questions, either in writing, but preferably, we'd like as many of you as possible to call in live on the day of the meeting and have an actual conversation with James. Next, please. So a few tips for effective participation. We'd like you to remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting. So going back to what James had talked about, why is the FDA there and what is it they want to learn? You could review these discussion questions in advance. And if you have something important to share, try to relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question, and then call in. This meeting won't happen unless we have people calling in, and we hope as many of you as possible will call in. And it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that somebody already voiced, even if it was similar to what you experienced. But when you share that symptom or treatment, try to give it a personal or unique perspective that was very personal to your story. Try to keep your comments concise and focused. We want to hear from as many people as possible about this emotional topic, and we want to make it as representative as possible of the greater community of people living with cancer cachexia. And we want to remind you too, if you think of something after the meeting, you can always send in an additional comment after the meeting for the next 30 days after the meeting's completed. So to participate in the meeting, there will be on the Cancer Support Community website, there'll be information about how to register. This is where you'll join the webcast. And for the polling questions we discussed, and we'd like you to call in comments and written submissions. These are all ways that you can participate. Please know your responses will be kept confidential. We ask people just to use their first name. The registration link will be open soon on the Cancer Support Community, not GSA, the Cancer Support CSC website. And comments with answers to the questions, like I said earlier, can be submitted for 30 days after the meeting. And all of these comments and all of this content will eventually be submitted in the Voice of the Patient report. And this is the report we're going to send to the FDA for them to review and to use in their drug review. Next. So in summary, this is your opportunity to be part of the process. It's a unique opportunity. It's a way that you can have meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development. Your collective voices must be heard at the beginning of the process to help companies design better clinical trials that meet your needs, and to help the FDA assess the risks and benefits of new drugs with a full understanding of what the impact of cancer cachexia is on people and what the patient perspective is. So please join us on November 2nd, help us to get the word out and help to make a difference. Next. So now we have, I think we've got a little bit of time left for questions. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. Anything to do with the meeting, we'll be glad to answer, or anything about the FDA.
Yeah, so there was one question I saw come in around, why are we discussing this with the FDA when we're faced, when this is not being discussed fully with us by our doctors? And there was some comment about, just say keep eating, eat healthy. This is a great question, because this is exactly why this meeting is so important. First, there's no approved treatments for cancer cachexia. And so, may be challenging for your doctors to discuss it with you when they don't have tools in their toolbox to try to help you with this condition. And so the more we can do to help facilitate drug development, facilitate FDA approvals, that certainly will help. But with regard to, eating and eating healthy, those are exactly the kinds of experiences we'd love to hear about at this PFDD meeting. Larry talked about, how the second topic, our afternoon topic, will be all about, what you do to try to manage your cancer cachexia symptoms. Well, eating, diet, exercise, these approaches to managing the disease, even though they aren't medicines, we need to hear about those and hear, whether or not those things are helping or working for you or your loved one, because that will help identify the unmet need that exists in cancer cachexia, which then helps FDA in giving the right, urgency and attention to new drugs that may be coming along in the pipeline. So I see there's another question that was put in the chat about if there's already drugs in mind to help with this condition. So this PFDD meeting is not designed to focus on any particular drug that may be in development. I would maybe ask Felicia to speak if there's any known resources of any potential studies that are ongoing. I know you can also always look at clinicaltrials.gov to see if there are any clinical trials ongoing for new drugs in development. But the great thing about this PFDD meeting is that it will help inform the design of trials and help FDA in evaluating that benefit risk of drugs for all drugs for cancer cachexia.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something more about what Daryl asked. Daryl, one of the things that we want to help the FDA understand is how cachexia in some ways is underdiagnosed, that it's not, it's not recognized fully as a syndrome within itself, needing treatments. Because one of the things that the FDA does is when a company is designing a new clinical trial or thinking about it, they send the trial design to the FDA to review it. And we will want to make sure that there are, this meeting, I think, is going to help the FDA better understand cachexia, what it is, how it impacts people's lives. And it will help, hopefully it will help further the case of like getting this recognized as a syndrome, and that this is something that needs drugs to be developed for.
Yeah, so I see that Evelyn, posted a comment about, when you have no appetite, sometimes you're hungry, but you don't want to eat. This is something she deals with daily. While, cancer cachexia is kind of referring to the weight loss, there's a range of symptoms that relate to cancer cachexia. And so loss of appetite, loss of interest in eating, or maybe being repelled by, the thought of eating, as well as the other things that are downstream from losing weight, loss of strength or fatigue. These are all symptoms that are within the scope. It's not just, what is the impact of weight loss alone, but what is the impact of the full range of different symptoms that you're experiencing that are related to your cancer cachexia. So I just want to thank Evelyn for making that comment, because it does highlight an area that we really want to hear about, and that's really that first topic that Larry described of what is it to live with cancer cachexia.
So we have a question from Daryl in the Q&A box about will we be able to get a copy of the presentation? So early on, we mentioned that this would be available. We're recording right now, so this presentation will be available on Facebook and YouTube. So you're more than welcome to view the recording again and also share with your support groups to encourage participation on November 2nd. And I also just wanted to go back to Catherine's question and really just elevate some of the things that James, you were saying. The reason for this PFDD is truly so that all stakeholders can learn more about cancer cachexia. So being in front of the FDA is very much so important, but stakeholders such as pharmaceutical companies, as well as clinicians and providers, participate and view a lot of these PFDDs to get more knowledge about what's going on in the community and to understand some of the conditions that they can focus on when it comes to drug development and clinical trials. So just being mindful that elevating this condition and raising awareness really could be the next step in development that could help others when it comes to the treatment of cachexia and understanding it a little bit further.
And just to add to what Felicia said, that right after the meeting is finished, there'll be a recording of the full meeting that happens on November 2nd that will be available for viewing on the Cancer Support Community website. So anyone can watch the meeting, afterwards. And eventually that's where we will also post that Voice of the Patient report, which anybody could download, print, or just read online. So those resources will all be available for anyone in the future.
So I will make a plug for our next slide, which is really asking people if they're interested in being a discussion starter for our November 2nd event. So not only as James and Larry outlined, the program will hear from panelists who are caregivers as well as those living with cancer cachexia, but we're asking the audience if you have cachexia or have been a caregiver to someone with cancer cachexia, if you'd be willing to participate as a discussion starter for the event. So basically you would be on to answer some specific questions and talk a little bit about the conditions that you are managing and trying to treat. So if you want more information about becoming a discussion starter, you can email CSC at action@cancersupportcommunity.org, and we'll get you the correct information and talk to you a little bit further about how to participate in the meeting. Okay, I have some more questions coming through just thank you. And lastly, just wanted to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today. And we would love for all of you to join us again on November 2nd for our PFDD on cancer cachexia. And below is the landing page where you can register to attend the event. So at www.cancerSupportCommunity.org/cachexia-PFDD. So if you're interested in attending, please register, and we'd love to see you virtually on the 2nd. So with that, thank you so much for attending today, and we'll conclude our program.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.